Hey guys, tonight we begin with a side of baseball you might not have known too much about. Let me know in the comments where you're tuning in from and what time it is for you. It's always fascinating to see who's joining us from around the world. Now, dim the lights. Maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum. And let's ease into tonight's journey together. It's October 1919. And the most beloved team in baseball just threw the World Series. Not because they couldn't hit a curveball or because they choked under pressure, but because they were paid to lose. 8 professional athletes, men who had dedicated their lives to becoming the best in the world at America's pastime, deliberately botched plays, struck out on purpose, and handed victory to their opponents for a few $1,000s in dirty money. The Chicago White Sox, ironically nicknamed the Black Sox, had just committed what would become the most infamous act of betrayal in sports history. But here's the thing that'll blow your mind. This wasn't just some random scandal that happened out of nowhere. This was the inevitable result of a system so corrupt, so twisted, and so fundamentally broken that it was practically designed to create cheaters. You see, while everyone knows about the Black Sox scandal, almost nobody knows about the web of lies, manipulation, and downright evil that created the conditions for it to happen. And trust me, once you understand how deep this rabbit hole goes, you'll never look at baseball the same way again. But to understand how America's favorite pastime became a playground for criminals and con artists, we need to go back to the very beginning and uncover the truth about how baseball was really invented. For over a century, Americans were told a beautiful fairy tale about baseball's origins. The story went like this. In 1839, a noble Civil War hero named Abner Doubleday was hanging out in Cooperstown, New York, when inspiration struck. He picked up a stick, drew some lines in the dirt, and invented baseball right there on the spot. It was the perfect origin story for America's national pastime. Invented by a war hero in a quaint little town, embodying everything pure and good about the American spirit. There's just one tiny problem with this heartwarming tale. It's complete nonsense. The truth is that baseball wasn't invented by one person in one magical moment. It evolved from older games that had been played in England for decades, maybe even centuries. Games like rounders, cricket, and something called town ball were brought to America by immigrants, and they slowly morphed into something that looked like modern baseball. But here's where it gets really interesting. The Doubleday story wasn't just a harmless mistake or a case of misremembered history. It was a deliberate lie, created by a commission that had a very specific agenda. In 1905, Albert Spaulding, who made a fortune selling sporting goods, decided he needed to prove that baseball was a purely American invention. Why? Because he wanted to sell more equipment by wrapping his products in patriotic mythology. So, Spaulding created what he called the Mills Commission, supposedly to investigate baseball's origins. But this wasn't a real investigation. It was a publicity stunt. The commission members already knew what conclusion they wanted to reach before they even started. They cherry-picked evidence, ignored contradictory facts, and when they couldn't find proof that supported their predetermined conclusion, they just made stuff up. The whole thing was based on a single letter from a guy named Abner Graves, who claimed he saw Doubleday invent baseball when they were both kids. But here's the kicker. Graves was later committed to an asylum for paranoid behavior. Oh, and by the way, Doubleday himself never once claimed to have invented baseball, despite writing extensively about his life and keeping detailed journals. This wasn't just some innocent mistake. This was corporate propaganda disguised as historical research, and it worked so well that people believed it for over 100 years. But this web of lies around baseball's origins was just the beginning of something much darker. The real story of how baseball became organized reveals a pattern of greed, manipulation, and corruption that would plague the sport for generations. And it all started with one man who figured out how to turn a simple game into a money-making machine. In 1869, something happened that would forever change the nature of baseball. The Cincinnati Red Stockings became the first fully professional baseball team, meaning they actually paid their players to play. This might sound like a good thing. After all, shouldn't talented athletes be compensated for their skills? But what followed was a masterclass in how to exploit human beings for profit. Here's what most people don't realize. The early baseball owners weren't sports fans who wanted to create something beautiful. They were businessmen who saw an opportunity to make money off other people's talents. And they set up a system that was designed to keep players poor while owners got rich. The man who pioneered this exploitation was Harry Wright, the manager of the Cincinnati Red Stockings. Wright figured out that if he could create a team of full-time players who were better than the part-time amateurs, he could charge people to watch them play. It was genius from a business perspective, but it was also the beginning of a century of abuse. You see, Wright and the owners who followed him created something called the reserve clause. This was a contract provision that essentially made players the property of their teams. Once you signed with a team, you couldn't leave and play for anyone else, even if they offered you more money. You were stuck with that team for life, unless they decided to trade you or release you. Imagine if your boss could prevent you from ever working for anyone else in your entire industry. That's exactly what the reserve clause did to baseball players. It killed competition for their services and allowed owners to pay them whatever they wanted, knowing the players had no alternatives. The players tried to fight back. In 1885, they formed something called the Brotherhood of Professional Baseball Players, which was basically the first players' union. But the owners were too powerful, and they crushed any attempts at organization. When players tried to start their own league in 1890, the owners used their wealth and political connections to destroy it. But here's where the story gets really twisted. The owners didn't just want to control their players' salaries. They wanted to control their entire lives. They inserted moral clauses into contracts that allowed them to fine or fire players for drinking, gambling, or pretty much any behavior the owners didn't like. On the surface, this seemed reasonable. Who wants drunk or gambling-addicted athletes representing their team? But what was really happening was that owners were setting up a system where they could act like moral authorities while being completely immoral themselves. They were paying players poverty wages, treating them like property, and then acting shocked when some of those players turned to gambling or other vices to make ends meet. This created a perfect storm of resentment and desperation that would eventually lead to the Black Sox scandal. But before we get to that, we need to talk about the man who turned baseball's corruption into an art form. Charles Comiskey was the kind of man who could smile at your face while picking your pocket. He was charming, well-connected, and had a reputation as a baseball innovator. He was also one of the most ruthlessly greedy human beings who ever lived. And his treatment of his players was so bad that it directly led to the most famous scandal in sports history. Comiskey owned the Chicago White Sox during their glory years in the 1910s, when they were one of the best teams in baseball. His players were incredibly talented, and they were bringing in huge crowds and massive profits. But Comiskey had a simple philosophy. Why pay players fairly when you can pay them almost nothing and keep the money for yourself? Here's how cheap this guy was. He promised his players bonuses for good performance, then found ridiculous ways to avoid paying them. He once promised a pitcher a bonus if he won 30 games in a season. When the pitcher won 29 games, Comiskey benched him for the rest of the season to avoid paying the bonus. But it gets worse. Comiskey was so cheap that he made his players pay for their own uniforms, and he only had them cleaned every 2 weeks. His players were literally known as the Black Sox because their uniforms were so dirty. Meanwhile, Comiskey was building himself mansions and vacationing in Europe. The players knew they were being exploited, but they couldn't do anything about it because of the reserve clause. They were trapped. They were the best players in the world, but they were making less money than factory workers. Some of them had to work other jobs in the off-season just to feed their families. This is where the story gets really tragic. These weren't bad guys who decided to become criminals. These were talented athletes who were being systematically abused by a system that was designed to exploit them. When gamblers approached them with offers of easy money, it wasn't because they were naturally greedy. It was because they were desperate. The 8 players who eventually got caught up in the Black Sox scandal weren't the only ones in baseball who were approached by gamblers. They were just the ones who said yes. And they said yes because Comiskey had created conditions that made them vulnerable to corruption. But here's the part that'll really make you angry. When the scandal finally came to light, Comiskey acted like he was the victim. He suspended the players and claimed he was shocked, that his underpaid, mistreated employees had been tempted by money. He even tried to portray himself as a reformer who was cleaning up the game. What Comiskey didn't count on was that the full story would eventually come out. And when it did, it revealed something much bigger than just 8 players taking bribes. It revealed a system of corruption that went all the way to the top of baseball's power structure. The gambling problem in baseball wasn't new in 1919. It had been festering for decades, and the people in charge knew about it, but chose to ignore it because it was profitable. But this willful blindness was about to catch up with them in a way that would shake the entire sport to its core. While Charles Comiskey was nickel and diming his players, something else was happening in the shadows of baseball that would make the Black Sox scandal look like child's play. There was an entire underground economy built around baseball gambling, and it was so sophisticated and well organized that it might as well have been a parallel league. This wasn't just fans making casual bets on their favorite teams. This was organized crime, with networks of bookmakers, fixers, and corrupt officials who had turned baseball into their personal money-printing machine. And the scariest part? The people running Major League Baseball knew about it and chose to look the other way. Here's how the system worked. Professional gamblers would identify players who were vulnerable, usually guys who were underpaid, in debt, or had personal problems. They'd approach these players with offers that seemed too good to refuse. Not just money, but also threats. The gamblers weren't just offering carrots, they were also carrying sticks. The most notorious of these gamblers was a guy named Arnold Rothstein. Rothstein was known as the Brain because he was incredibly smart and calculating. He didn't just bet on games, he invested in corruption. He would study teams, identify their weak spots, and then systematically exploit them. He was like a Wall Street trader, except instead of stocks and bonds, he was trading in human weakness. Rothstein had connections everywhere. He knew politicians, judges, police chiefs, and even some baseball executives. He operated with virtual impunity because he had so many people on his payroll. When he decided to fix the 1919 World Series, he didn't just approach a few players and hope for the best. He orchestrated a complex operation that involved multiple intermediaries, backup plans, and even contingencies for what to do if the fix was exposed. But here's what's really shocking. Rothstein wasn't working alone, and he wasn't even the biggest player in the game. There were gambling syndicates operating in every major city, and they all had their hooks in baseball. Some of them were so bold that they would actually attend games and signal to players on the field when they needed certain plays to be made or missed. The people running baseball knew this was happening. They received reports about suspicious betting patterns, they heard rumors about fixed games, and they even had evidence of players meeting with known gamblers. But they chose to ignore it because the gambling was actually driving up attendance and interest in the games. Think about it. If people are betting on baseball games, they're more likely to pay attention to baseball. They're more likely to buy tickets, follow the standings, and talk about the sport with their friends. The gambling wasn't hurting baseball's popularity. It was helping it. So the executives made a calculated decision to let it continue. This created a culture of corruption that went far beyond just the Black Sox. Players throughout the league were being approached by gamblers, and many of them were saying yes. Some were taking money to lose games, others were taking money to win by specific margins, and still others were just selling information about injuries or team strategy. The 1919 World Series wasn't an aberration. It was the logical conclusion of a system that had been broken for years. But it was also the moment when the corruption became so obvious that it could no longer be ignored. However, the real scandal wasn't just that 8 players took bribes. The real scandal was what happened after they got caught, and how baseball's response to the crisis revealed even deeper levels of corruption and hypocrisy. When news of the Black Sox scandal finally broke in 1920, the people running baseball faced a choice. They could admit that the sport had a systemic corruption problem and take real steps to fix it, or they could find a few scapegoats, punish them harshly, and pretend that everything was fine. Guess which option they chose. The cover-up that followed the Black Sox scandal was almost as corrupt as the original crime. It involved lying to the public, destroying evidence, and creating a false narrative that protected the people who were really responsible, while destroying the lives of players who were just following a script that had been written by their bosses. First, let's talk about what really happened during the 1919 World Series. The 8 players who were accused of throwing the series didn't actually throw the entire series. Some of them tried to play normally once they realized they weren't going to get all the money they were promised. Others never fully committed to the fix in the first place. The whole thing was a mess of confused signals, double crosses, and players who weren't even sure what they were supposed to be doing. But when the scandal broke, baseball's executives needed a simple story that would satisfy the public's demand for justice. So they created a narrative where 8 evil players conspired to betray innocent fans, and they stuck to that story even though they knew it wasn't true. Here's what they didn't tell the public. Several team owners and league executives had been aware of the gambling problem for years and had done nothing about it. Some of them had even profited from it indirectly. When rumors about the 1919 World Series started circulating immediately after the series ended, these same executives chose to ignore them because they didn't want to deal with the fallout. The player who really blew the whistle on the scandal was a guy named Rube Benton, who had been offered money to throw games himself. Benton went to the league office and provided detailed information about the gambling network, including names, dates, and specific amounts of money. But instead of investigating his claims, the league executives told him to keep quiet and threatened to ban him from baseball if he talked to reporters. It was only when a grand jury investigation forced their hand that baseball's executives finally took action. And even then, they did everything they could to control the narrative and limit the damage to their own reputations. The trial that followed was a complete joke. Key evidence mysteriously disappeared, including the signed confessions of several players. Witnesses changed their stories or refused to testify. The prosecutors seemed more interested in protecting baseball than in finding the truth. It was like watching a magic show where the magician makes justice disappear. The 8 players were acquitted in court, but that didn't matter to baseball's new commissioner, Judge Kennesaw Mountain Landis. Landis had been brought in specifically to clean up baseball's image, and he decided that the best way to do that was to ban the 8 players for life, regardless of what the court had decided. Here's the really twisted part. While Landis was positioning himself as the moral savior of baseball, he was actually perpetuating the same corrupt system that had created the scandal in the first place. He banned the players who had been caught, but he did nothing to address the underlying problems that had made them vulnerable to corruption in the first place. The reserve clause stayed in place, keeping players trapped with their teams. Owners continued to pay poverty wages while making huge profits. The gambling networks that had corrupted the 1919 World Series continued to operate. They just became more careful about not getting caught. Landis's solution to the Black Sox scandal was essentially to shoot the messengers while ignoring the message. He created the illusion that baseball had been cleaned up, but in reality, he had just made the corruption less visible. But this whitewashing of the Black Sox scandal was just the beginning of baseball's long history of covering up inconvenient truths. The patterns that were established in 1920 would be repeated over and over again whenever baseball faced a crisis that threatened its image or profits. Just when it seemed like baseball might not survive the Black Sox scandal, something miraculous happened. A larger-than-life character emerged who was so entertaining and charismatic that he completely changed the conversation about baseball. His name was Babe Ruth, and while everyone knows him as the greatest home run hitter of all time, very few people know that he was also the most successful piece of propaganda in sports history. Don't get me wrong, Ruth was genuinely amazing at baseball. He revolutionized the game with his power-hitting and larger-than-life personality. But the way he was marketed and promoted by baseball's executives was a calculated effort to make people forget about the corruption that had been exposed in the Black Sox scandal. Here's what happened. In 1920, the same year the Black Sox scandal broke, Ruth was sold by the Boston Red Sox to the New York Yankees. This wasn't just a typical player trade. It was a publicity stunt designed to generate positive headlines about baseball. The Yankees immediately put Ruth in the spotlight, promoting him as the antithesis of everything that was wrong with the game. While the Black Sox players were portrayed as greedy and corrupt, Ruth was presented as pure and innocent. He was the Sultan of SWAT, the Bambino, a big kid who just loved playing baseball. His every move was covered by the press, and his home runs were treated like national celebrations. But here's what the publicity machine didn't want you to know. Ruth was actually just as much a product of baseball's corrupt system as the Black Sox players were. He was making more money than any other player in the game, but only because his drawing power was so enormous that the Yankees couldn't afford to underpay him. If Ruth had been a good but not great player, he would have been trapped in the same poverty that had made the Black Sox vulnerable to corruption. The Yankees used Ruth's success to distract from the fundamental problems in baseball. Instead of addressing the reserve clause, the low salaries, or the gambling networks, they created a spectacle that made people forget about those issues. Every time Ruth hit a home run, it was like collective amnesia about the Black Sox scandal. This wasn't accidental. The Yankees and Major League Baseball invested heavily in promoting Ruth because they knew he was their ticket to respectability. They created newsreels, arranged publicity stunts, and even made a movie about him. Ruth became the most famous athlete in America, and his fame washed away the stain of the Black Sox scandal. But the Ruth phenomenon also created a new problem. It established a template for how baseball would handle future scandals. Instead of addressing root causes, they would just create distractions. Instead of making systemic changes, they would just find new heroes to put on pedestals. This pattern would repeat itself over and over again throughout baseball's history. Whenever the sport faced a crisis that threatened its reputation, the solution was always the same: find a shiny new star to distract people from the ugly truth. Meanwhile, the real problems in baseball continued to fester. The gambling networks that had corrupted the 1919 World Series didn't disappear. They just became more sophisticated. The exploitative relationship between owners and players didn't improve. It just became more subtle. The culture of corruption that had made the Black Sox scandal possible didn't change. It just went underground. Ruth's success bought baseball time and credibility, but it didn't solve any of the underlying issues. And, as we'll see, those unresolved problems would eventually manifest in new and even more disturbing ways. The next chapter in baseball's dark history involved something even more sinister than gambling: the systematic exclusion of an entire race of people from America's national pastime. While Babe Ruth was hitting home runs and charming America, there was another group of baseball players who were just as talented, just as dedicated, and just as deserving of fame and fortune. The only difference was the color of their skin. And for that reason alone, they were banned from Major League Baseball for over 60 years. The story of baseball's color barrier is usually told as a story of progress: how Jackie Robinson broke the color line in 1947 and integrated the sport. But that narrative misses the real story, which is much darker and more shameful. The real story is about how baseball actively and systematically excluded black players. Not because they weren't good enough, but because racism was profitable. Here's what most people don't know: black players weren't excluded from baseball from the beginning. In the early days of professional baseball, there were actually several black players in the major leagues. Moses Fleetwood Walker played for the Toledo Blue Stockings in 1884. His brother, Wellday, also played professionally. There were others, too, scattered throughout the early professional leagues. But as baseball became more organized and more profitable, team owners made a calculated decision to exclude black players. This wasn't because of some ancient tradition or unwritten rule. It was a deliberate business decision based on appealing to white fans and white players who didn't want to compete against black athletes. The man who formalized this racist policy was Adrian "Cap" Anson, who played for the Chicago White Stockings in the 1880s. Anson was one of the biggest stars in baseball, and he used his influence to pressure other teams to exclude black players. He would refuse to play against teams that had black players, and since he was such a draw for fans, other teams would give in to his demands. Anson's campaign was incredibly effective. By the 1890s, black players had been almost completely pushed out of professional baseball. But here's the really sinister part. This wasn't just about keeping black players out of the majors. It was about creating a system where black players couldn't make a living playing baseball at all. You see, when Major League Baseball excluded black players, it also used its influence to pressure minor league teams, semi-professional teams, and even amateur teams to do the same. The goal wasn't just segregation, it was economic warfare. They wanted to make it impossible for black players to earn money playing baseball anywhere. This forced black players to create their own leagues, which became known as the Negro Leagues. But these leagues faced constant financial pressure because they were locked out of the best stadiums, the best markets, and the best media coverage. They were forced to barnstorm around the country, playing in whatever venues would have them, often for tiny crowds and even smaller paychecks. The talent in the Negro Leagues was incredible. Players like Josh Gibson, Cool Papa Bell, and Satchel Paige were just as good as any players in the majors, and some of them were probably better. But they were denied the opportunity to prove it on the biggest stage because of the color of their skin. Major League Baseball knew how good these players were. There were exhibition games between Major League teams and Negro League teams, and the Negro League teams often won. But instead of using this as evidence that the color barrier was unjust, Major League Baseball used it as evidence that they needed to strengthen the barrier. The hypocrisy was staggering. Baseball's executives would give speeches about the sport's moral value and its role in building character, while simultaneously maintaining a system that was based on racial hatred. They would talk about baseball as America's democratic pastime, while denying the most basic opportunities to American citizens based on their race. This wasn't just morally wrong, it was also economically stupid. By excluding black players, Major League Baseball was depriving itself of some of the greatest talent in the history of the sport. They were also missing out on the opportunity to tap into black communities as a source of fans and revenue. But the racism wasn't just about excluding black players. It was also about creating a culture within baseball that was hostile to any form of diversity or inclusion. The all-white composition of the major leagues wasn't just a policy. It was a statement about what kind of sport baseball wanted to be. This racist system would remain in place for decades, long after American society had begun to change. And when it finally began to crumble, it wouldn't be because baseball's leadership had a moral awakening. It would be because economic and social pressures made it impossible to maintain. The breaking of the color barrier in 1947 is often celebrated as a triumph of justice over prejudice. But the real story is much more complicated and much less flattering to the people who ran baseball. It's a story of resistance, calculation, and a system that changed only when it absolutely had to. The story of how baseball's color barrier was broken is usually told like this. Branch Rickey, the general manager of the Brooklyn Dodgers, was a progressive visionary who wanted to do the right thing. So he signed Jackie Robinson in 1947 and integrated baseball. It's a nice story, but it's not true. The real story is that Branch Rickey was a shrewd businessman who realized that breaking the color barrier would give his team a competitive advantage and make him money. The moral arguments were just marketing. Here's what really happened. By the 1940s, it was becoming clear that the color barrier in baseball was economically unsustainable. Black fans were a huge, untapped market, and black players represented a pool of talent that could give any team that signed them a significant advantage. Several factors were converging to make integration inevitable. First, World War II had changed American attitudes about race. Black soldiers had fought and died for their country, and it was becoming harder to justify excluding them from America's national pastime. Second, the Negro Leagues had proven that black players could draw crowds and generate revenue. Third, other sports were beginning to integrate, and baseball was starting to look backward and racist in comparison. Branch Rickey saw all of this and realized that the first team to sign black players would have a huge advantage. They would get first pick of the best black talent, they would tap into the black fan base, and they would generate enormous publicity. It was a brilliant business move disguised as a moral crusade. But Rickey also knew that integration wouldn't be easy. He needed to find the right player, someone who was not only incredibly talented, but also had the personality and character to handle the enormous pressure and hostility that would come with being the first black player in the majors. That's where Jackie Robinson came in. Robinson wasn't just a great athlete. He was also a college graduate, a military veteran, and someone who had experience dealing with hostile crowds and racist opponents. He was perfect for the role that Rickey needed him to play. But here's what the feel-good story doesn't tell you. Robinson's integration of baseball was incredibly limited and carefully controlled. He was essentially a test case, and his every move was monitored and managed by the Dodgers organization. He was told not to fight back against racial taunts, not to argue with umpires, and not to do anything that might give opponents ammunition to argue that integration was a mistake. Robinson succeeded brilliantly, both on and off the field. He was Rookie of the Year in 1947, and he went on to have a Hall of Fame career. But his success didn't lead to the rapid integration that you might expect. Instead, most teams continued to exclude black players for years after Robinson broke the barrier. Why? Because they realized that they didn't have to integrate to remain competitive. As long as most teams were still all white, no single team would gain a significant advantage by signing black players. They could continue to discriminate without paying a competitive price. This led to a weird situation where baseball was technically integrated but practically still segregated. By 1953, 6 years after Robinson's debut, there were still only about 20 black players in all of Major League Baseball. Some teams didn't integrate until the 1960s, and others maintained unofficial quotas that limited the number of black players they would sign. The resistance to integration wasn't just from fans or players, it was also from within baseball's power structure. Team executives, league officials, and even some umpires actively worked to limit the impact of integration. They would schedule black players for fewer games, give them less playing time, and subject them to more scrutiny than white players. Black players who made it to the majors in the 1950s and 1960s faced a level of hostility and discrimination that's hard to imagine today. They were excluded from team hotels, barred from restaurants, and subjected to constant racial taunts from fans and opponents. Some players received death threats, and many had their families threatened as well. The most shameful part of this story is how long it took for baseball to fully integrate. It wasn't until the 1970s that most teams had significant numbers of black players, And it wasn't until the 1980s that baseball truly looked like the diverse sport it is today. But even as baseball was slowly integrating, it was developing new problems that would eventually explode into scandals that made the Black Sox look like a minor infraction. The sport was about to enter an era of corruption that would make everything that came before seem quaint by comparison. By the 1960s, baseball had survived the Black Sox scandal, weathered the integration of the sport, and established itself as a multi-million-dollar industry. But success brought new temptations and new opportunities for corruption. The sport was about to enter an era where the scandals would be bigger, the stakes would be higher, and the cover-ups would be more sophisticated than anything that had come before. The first sign of trouble came in the form of gambling, but not the kind of gambling that had plagued baseball in the 1920s. This was a new breed of corruption that involved organized crime, massive amounts of money, and a level of sophistication that made the Black Sox scandal look like a backyard game. The key figure in this new era of corruption was a man named Sam Giancana, who was the boss of the Chicago outfit, one of the most powerful organized crime families in America. Giancana had figured out that professional sports were a perfect vehicle for money laundering, illegal gambling, and other criminal activities. Here's how it worked. Giancana and other organized crime figures would identify players, coaches, and even officials who were vulnerable to corruption. They would then systematically cultivate these relationships, offering money, women, drugs, or whatever else it took to compromise these individuals. Once they had someone on the hook, they would use them to manipulate games, point spreads, and betting outcomes. This wasn't just about fixing games. It was about creating a shadow economy that operated parallel to legitimate baseball. Organized crime figures were essentially running their own version of the sport, where the outcomes were predetermined and the profits were enormous. The scope of this corruption was staggering. By the 1970s, there were credible reports that organized crime had infiltrated dozens of teams across multiple sports, including baseball. They had relationships with players, coaches, umpires, and even some team executives. In some cases, they were influencing not just individual games, but entire seasons. But here's what made this corruption different from the Black Sox scandal. It was much harder to detect and much easier to cover up. The criminals involved were more sophisticated, the money was bigger, and the networks were more extensive. They didn't need to fix entire games. They could influence specific plays, specific innings, or specific statistics that would affect betting outcomes without necessarily changing who won or lost. The baseball establishment knew this was happening, but they were in a difficult position. If they acknowledged the extent of the corruption, it would destroy the sport's credibility and cost them millions of dollars in lost revenue. If they ignored it, they would be allowing criminals to manipulate their sport for profit. They chose a middle path. They would investigate and prosecute the most obvious cases while ignoring the broader patterns of corruption. This allowed them to maintain the appearance of being tough on crime while actually doing very little to address the real problems. The most famous case from this era involved a Cincinnati Reds player named Pete Rose, who was later found to have bet on baseball games, including games involving his own team. But Rose wasn't just a rogue player who made some bad decisions. He was part of a much larger network of corruption that involved dozens of players and hundreds of games. The Pete Rose scandal broke in the 1980s, and it created a massive crisis for baseball. Here was one of the most famous and successful players in the history of the sport, and he was caught betting on games. The implications were enormous. and the scandal threatened to destroy baseball's credibility, just as the Black Sox scandal had done 60 years earlier. But the response to the Pete Rose scandal revealed just how much baseball had learned about managing crises and controlling narratives. Instead of allowing the scandal to spiral out of control, baseball's leadership mounted a sophisticated damage control campaign that would become a template for handling future scandals. The Rose case also revealed something else. The corruption that had been festering in baseball for decades was finally starting to surface in ways that couldn't be ignored or covered up. The sport was about to face a reckoning that would expose just how deep the rot had spread. Pete Rose was everything baseball wanted in a hero. He was scrappy, hard-working, and incredibly talented. He played with an intensity that earned him the nickname Charlie Hustle. He broke Ty Cobb's all-time hits record and became the face of baseball in the 1970s and 1980s. But behind the scenes, Rose was living a double life that would eventually destroy his reputation and expose a web of corruption that baseball had been trying to hide for decades. Rose's gambling problem didn't start when he became a manager. It started when he was still a player, and it grew into an addiction that consumed his life. He wasn't just betting on baseball, he was betting on everything. Horse races, football games, basketball games, you name it. But when he started betting on baseball games, including games involving his own team, he crossed a line that hadn't been crossed since the Black Sox scandal. Here's what made Rose's situation so dangerous. He wasn't just a player betting on games. He was a manager, which meant he had direct control over the outcomes of the games he was betting on. He could decide which pitchers to use, which players to start, and how to manage crucial situations. When you're betting on your own team to win, that might seem harmless. But when you're betting on your team to lose, or when you're betting on specific aspects of the game like the total number of runs scored, you have the power to influence those outcomes. The investigation into Rose's gambling began in 1989, and it revealed a pattern of behavior that was far more extensive than anyone had imagined. Rose wasn't just making casual bets. He was working with bookmakers, loan sharks, and other criminals who were part of organized gambling networks. He owed hundreds of thousands of dollars to these people, and they had leverage over him that could have been used to influence games. What made this even more scandalous was that Rose lied about it for years. When confronted with evidence of his gambling, he denied everything. He claimed he was being set up, that the evidence was fabricated, and that he was the victim of a conspiracy. He maintained his innocence for over a decade, even as more and more evidence emerged that proved he was lying. The baseball establishment faced a terrible choice. Rose was one of the most popular players in the history of the sport, and he was about to be eligible for the Hall of Fame. If they banned him from baseball, they would be admitting that one of their biggest stars was a criminal. If they didn't ban him, they would be sending a message that gambling on baseball was acceptable. Commissioner Bart Giamatti made the decision to ban Rose from baseball for life. This was an incredibly harsh punishment, but Giamatti felt it was necessary to send a message that gambling on baseball would not be tolerated. Rose accepted the ban in exchange for an agreement that Major League Baseball would not make any formal finding about whether he had bet on baseball games. But here's the really twisted part. The Rose scandal wasn't just about one player who made bad decisions. It was about a system that had allowed this corruption to flourish for years without being detected. Rose had been gambling on baseball for years, and he had been working with known criminals, but nobody in baseball's hierarchy had noticed or done anything about it. The investigation revealed that Rose had been associating with people who were under FBI surveillance for organized crime activities. He had been making bets through bookmakers who were connected to major gambling operations. He had been accumulating massive debts to people who had a history of using violence to collect what they were owed. All of this was happening while Rose was one of the most visible figures in baseball, and yet nobody in the sports leadership had any idea what was going on. Either they were completely incompetent, or they were willfully ignoring obvious warning signs because they didn't want to deal with the consequences. The Rose scandal also revealed something else. The gambling networks that had been operating in the shadows of baseball for decades were much more extensive and sophisticated than anyone had realized. Rose wasn't working with small-time bookmakers. He was connected to major organized crime figures who were running multi-million-dollar operations. This raised uncomfortable questions about how many other players, coaches, and officials might be compromised by similar relationships. If Rose could gamble on baseball for years without being detected, how many other people were doing the same thing? Baseball's response to these questions was predictable. They claimed that Rose was an isolated case, that they had learned from their mistakes, and that they had implemented new safeguards to prevent similar problems in the future. But this was just another cover-up designed to protect the sport's image rather than address the real problems. The truth is that the Rose scandal was just the tip of the iceberg. The corruption that had been exposed was much deeper and more widespread than baseball was willing to admit. And as we'll see, the problems that created the Rose scandal were about to manifest in even more destructive ways. Just as baseball was trying to recover from the Pete Rose scandal, another crisis was brewing that would make everything that came before look like a minor inconvenience. Players were getting bigger, stronger, and more powerful at a rate that defied explanation. Home run records that had stood for decades were being shattered. Players who had been good but not great were suddenly putting up numbers that belonged in the Hall of Fame. The reason was simple. They were using performance-enhancing drugs. But what made this scandal so much worse than anything that had come before was that everyone knew it was happening, and everyone chose to look the other way. The steroid era didn't begin in the 1990s. It began in the 1980s, when a few players started experimenting with anabolic steroids and other performance-enhancing drugs. These early adopters saw immediate results. They got stronger, they recovered from injuries faster, and they performed better than they ever had before. Word spread quickly through baseball's underground networks. Players started sharing information about which drugs worked best, which doctors would prescribe them, and how to avoid getting caught. What started as a few players experimenting with steroids quickly became a full-scale epidemic. By the early 1990s, steroid use in baseball was so widespread that it was essentially an open secret. Players were talking about it in clubhouses, trainers were recommending it, and some team executives were actively encouraging it. The drugs weren't just being used by sluggers trying to hit more home runs, they were being used by pitchers trying to throw harder, by aging players trying to extend their careers, and by marginal players trying to make it to the big leagues. The most shocking thing about the steroid era was how blatant it was. Players were transforming their bodies in ways that were impossible to achieve through natural training. Mark McGwire went from being a skinny rookie to looking like a bodybuilder. Barry Bonds, who had been a great but not physically imposing player, suddenly became a massive, muscular home run machine. Sammy Sosa went from hitting 8 home runs in his first full season to hitting 66 home runs in 1998. These transformations were so dramatic that they should have been obvious to anyone who was paying attention. But baseball's leadership chose to ignore the evidence because the steroid era was incredibly profitable for the sport. The home run chase between McGwire and Sosa in 1998 was a marketing goldmine. After years of declining attendance and interest following the 1994 players' strike, baseball desperately needed something to bring fans back. The home run chase provided exactly that. People who hadn't watched baseball in years were suddenly tuning in to see if the home run record would be broken. Baseball's executives knew that steroids were behind the offensive explosion, but they didn't care. They were making more money than ever before, and they weren't about to kill the golden goose by cracking down on performance-enhancing drugs. This created a culture where steroid use wasn't just tolerated, it was practically required. Players who wanted to compete at the highest level felt like they had no choice but to use performance-enhancing drugs. Clean players found themselves at a massive disadvantage, and many of them were pushed out of the sport or forced to compromise their principles to keep their jobs. The steroid era also corrupted the record books in ways that may never be fully understood. Some of the most cherished records in baseball history were broken by players who were using performance-enhancing drugs. Home run records, RBI records, and even pitching records were all tainted by the widespread use of steroids. But the real scandal wasn't just that players were using steroids. It was that the entire baseball establishment was complicit in covering it up. Team doctors were prescribing steroids, trainers were administering them, and executives were pretending they didn't know what was happening. The hypocrisy was staggering. Baseball's leadership would give speeches about the integrity of the game while presiding over the most systematic cheating scandal in the history of professional sports. They would talk about being role models for children while allowing their players to use dangerous drugs that were sending a message that winning was more important than health or honesty. The steroid era would eventually come to an end, but not because baseball's leadership decided to do the right thing. It would end because external pressure made it impossible to continue the charade. But the damage that was done during those years would take decades to repair, and some of it may never be fully undone. The story of how the steroid era finally came to an end reveals just how deep the corruption had become, and how far baseball was willing to go to protect its image and profits. The steroid era might have continued indefinitely, if not for one man who decided that enough was enough. His name was Jose Canseco, and he was about to blow the whistle on the biggest cheating scandal in the history of professional sports. Canseco had been one of the biggest stars of the steroid era. He was part of the Bash Brothers duo with Mark McGwire in Oakland, and he was one of the first players to openly display the kind of massive, muscular physique that became common in the 1990s. He was also one of the first players to admit that he had used steroids, and he was willing to name names. In 2005, Canseco published a book called Juiced that detailed his experiences with steroids and identified dozens of other players who had used performance-enhancing drugs. The book was explosive, and it named some of the biggest stars in baseball, including McGwire, Sosa, Rafael Palmeiro, and Jason Giambi. Baseball's response to Canseco's book was predictable. They attacked his credibility, claimed he was lying, and suggested that he was just a bitter ex-player trying to make money. They portrayed him as a disgruntled employee who was making up stories to get attention. But Canseco's book was different from previous steroid allegations because he provided specific details about when, where, and how players had used steroids. He described training regimens, named specific drugs, and even provided information about which doctors and trainers were involved. His claims were too detailed and too specific to be dismissed as the ramblings of a bitter ex-player. More importantly, Canseco's book came at a time when external pressure was mounting on baseball to address the steroid problem. Congress was threatening to investigate. Federal law enforcement agencies were looking into steroid distribution networks. And the media was finally starting to ask serious questions about the obvious physical transformations that had been taking place in baseball. The breaking point came in 2003 when federal agents raided a company called BALCO, Bay Area Laboratory Cooperative, that had been supplying steroids to athletes in multiple sports. The BALCO investigation revealed a sophisticated steroid distribution network that had been operating for years, and it implicated several high-profile baseball players. Barry Bonds, who had become the most prominent figure in baseball, was directly connected to BALCO. His trainer, Greg Anderson, was one of the main figures in the BALCO network, and there was evidence that Bonds had been using steroids provided by the company. This was particularly damaging because Bonds had been chasing some of the most sacred records in baseball, including Hank Aaron's all-time home run record. The BALCO investigation also revealed something else. The steroid problem in baseball was much more organized and systematic than anyone had realized. This wasn't just individual players making bad decisions. It was a network of doctors, trainers, and suppliers who were providing performance-enhancing drugs to dozens of athletes. Faced with mounting evidence and increasing pressure from Congress, baseball finally decided to take action. But their response was typical of how the sport had handled previous scandals. They tried to do the minimum necessary to make the problem go away without addressing the underlying issues. In 2005, baseball implemented its first comprehensive steroid testing program. But the testing was weak, the penalties were minimal, and there were numerous loopholes that allowed players to continue using performance-enhancing drugs. It was more of a public relations move than a serious attempt to clean up the sport. The real reckoning came in 2007 when baseball commissioned former Senator George Mitchell to conduct an independent investigation into steroid use in the sport. The Mitchell Report, as it became known, was supposed to be a comprehensive examination of the steroid problem that would finally bring the truth to light. But, like so many other investigations in baseball history, the Mitchell Report was more about damage control than finding the truth. The report named 89 players who had allegedly used steroids, but it also made it clear that the steroid problem was much more widespread than the names in the report suggested. The Mitchell Report revealed that steroid use in baseball had been systematic, widespread, and tolerated by the sport's leadership for over a decade. It showed that team trainers had been providing steroids to players, that team executives had known about steroid use and done nothing to stop it, and that the sport's testing program had been deliberately designed to be ineffective. But even after the Mitchell Report, baseball's response was inadequate. A few players were suspended, a few careers were ended, and a few records were tainted. But the people who had enabled and profited from the steroid era faced no consequences. Team executives who had known about steroid use kept their jobs. Trainers who had provided steroids to players were quietly moved to other positions. The system that had allowed the steroid era to happen remained largely intact. The steroid scandal revealed something fundamental about baseball. When faced with a choice between doing the right thing and making money, the sport would choose money every time. The steroid era wasn't just a failure of individual players, it was a failure of an entire system that prioritized profits over integrity. But the steroid scandal was just the beginning of baseball's modern problems. The sport was about to face new challenges that would test its ability to maintain its reputation and relevance in an increasingly skeptical world. By the 2010s, baseball thought it had survived the worst of the steroid scandal and was ready to move forward. The sport had implemented stricter drug testing, suspended some high-profile players, and tried to rehabilitate its image. But the digital age brought new challenges that baseball was completely unprepared for. The first major scandal of the digital era involved sign stealing, which had been a part of baseball for over a century. But what happened with the Houston Astros in 2017 wasn't traditional sign stealing. It was a high-tech cheating scheme that used electronic equipment to steal signs and communicate them to batters in real time. Here's how it worked. The Astros set up a camera in center field that could capture the opposing catcher's signs. They fed the video to a monitor in the tunnel between the dugout and the clubhouse, where team personnel would watch the signs and relay them to the batter by banging on a trash can. One bang meant a fastball was coming. Two bangs meant an off-speed pitch. This scheme gave the Astros an enormous advantage. Knowing what pitch is coming is one of the biggest advantages a batter can have, and the Astros used this information to help win the 2017 World Series. They cheated their way to a championship, and they did it using technology that made their cheating virtually undetectable. The Astros scandal was particularly damaging because it involved an entire organization, not just individual players. Team executives, coaches, and players all participated in the scheme. It wasn't a case of a few bad apples. It was systematic cheating that went all the way to the top of the organization. When the scandal finally broke in 2019, it revealed something troubling about modern baseball. The sport was so focused on gaining competitive advantages that it had lost sight of basic ethical principles. The Astros weren't just trying to win games, they were trying to win at any cost, even if it meant completely undermining the integrity of the competition. But the Astros scandal also revealed something else. Baseball's ability to cover up and minimize scandals had reached new levels of sophistication. The league's response to the scandal was carefully calibrated to punish the Astros, just enough to satisfy public outrage without setting precedents that might be applied to other teams. The Astros lost some draft picks, paid some fines, and had a few executives suspended. But the players who actually participated in the cheating faced no consequences at all. The championship they won by cheating was never taken away. The records they set while cheating were never adjusted. The message was clear. If you cheat successfully enough, you can keep the rewards. This sent a terrible message to the rest of baseball and to fans who cared about fair play. It suggested that cheating was acceptable as long as you didn't get caught, and that even if you did get caught, the consequences would be minimal. The Astros scandal also highlighted a broader problem in modern baseball. The sport had become so obsessed with analytics and technology that it was losing sight of the human element that made it compelling. Teams were using advanced statistics, sophisticated scouting, and cutting-edge technology to gain every possible advantage. But they were also sucking the life out of the game. Baseball games were becoming longer, more predictable, and less exciting. The increased use of specialized relievers meant that most games followed the same pattern. The emphasis on launch angle and exit velocity meant that more and more plate appearances ended in either a home run, a strikeout, or a walk. The human drama that had made baseball compelling for over a century was being replaced by algorithmic optimization. This created a crisis of relevance for baseball. Younger fans were losing interest in the sport because it was becoming boring and predictable. The games were too long, the pace was too slow, and the outcomes were too predetermined. Baseball was in danger of becoming irrelevant in American culture. The sport's response to this crisis was typical. They made cosmetic changes that didn't address the underlying problems. They implemented a pitch clock to speed up games. They moved the mound back a few inches to reduce strikeouts, and they banned certain types of defensive shifts. But these changes were like putting a Band-Aid on a broken leg. They didn't fix the fundamental issues. The real problem was that baseball had become too focused on winning and not focused enough on entertainment. The sport had forgotten that it was supposed to be fun, both for the players and for the fans. The obsession with competitive advantage had turned baseball into a joyless, mechanical exercise that bore little resemblance to the game that had captivated America for over a century. But baseball's problems in the digital age weren't just about on-field issues. The sport was also facing new challenges related to how it interacted with fans, how it controlled its image, and how it dealt with criticism and controversy. The rise of social media created entirely new categories of problems for baseball. Suddenly, every player was a potential public relations disaster. Every controversial call was subject to instant replay and analysis, and every scandal could go viral in minutes. Baseball's traditional methods of controlling information and managing crises were completely inadequate for this new reality. The first major social media scandal involved a player named Josh Hader, who was about to pitch in the 2018 All-Star Game when old tweets from his teenage years were discovered and shared widely on social media. The tweets contained racist and homophobic language, and they created a massive controversy that overshadowed the All-Star Game itself. The Hader incident revealed how vulnerable baseball players had become to social media scrutiny. Every player's online history was now subject to investigation, and anything they had ever posted could be used against them. This created a climate of fear and paranoia that made players reluctant to express themselves authentically on social media. But the real problem wasn't just individual players making mistakes, it was that social media had made baseball's traditional methods of damage control obsolete. In the past, baseball could control the narrative around scandals by managing relationships with a small number of reporters and media outlets. But social media meant that anyone could break news, share opinions, and influence public perception. This democratization of information was particularly challenging for baseball because the sport had always relied on controlling information to maintain its image. Baseball's executives were used to being able to shape public opinion through carefully managed press conferences and strategic leaks to friendly reporters. But social media made it impossible to control the conversation. The Houston Astros scandal was a perfect example of how social media had changed the game. The initial reporting about the scandal came from traditional media outlets, but the story exploded on social media, where fans, former players, and amateur investigators shared information, theories, and evidence that kept the story alive long after baseball's executives wanted it to go away. Social media also made it much harder for baseball to dismiss or discredit critics. In the past, If someone criticized baseball, the sports executives could simply ignore them or try to discredit them through traditional media channels. But social media gave critics a platform to reach large audiences directly, and it made it much harder to silence dissenting voices. The most damaging aspect of social media for baseball was how it exposed the sport's hypocrisy and inconsistency. Every decision made by league officials was subject to instant analysis and comparison with previous decisions. Every statement made by executives was fact-checked and scrutinized. Every policy was examined for loopholes and contradictions. This level of scrutiny revealed that baseball's leadership was often arbitrary, inconsistent, and self-serving. The same executives who claimed to care about the integrity of the game would make decisions that clearly prioritized financial interests over competitive fairness. The same officials who talked about player safety would implement policies that actually increased the risk of injury. Social media also changed how fans interacted with the sport. In the past, fans had limited ways to express their opinions about baseball. They could attend games, buy merchandise, or write letters to newspapers. But social media gave fans a direct line to players, executives, and other fans, and it allowed them to organize and coordinate their responses to controversial decisions. This created new forms of fan activism that baseball was unprepared to handle. When fans were angry about a particular decision or policy, they could organize boycotts, launch petition campaigns, or create viral hashtags that put pressure on the sport's leadership. Baseball's executives, who were used to making decisions without much input from fans, suddenly found themselves accountable to a much broader and more vocal constituency. The social media era also created new opportunities for scandals and controversies. Players' private messages could be leaked, team executives' emails could be hacked, and internal communications could be shared publicly. The digital age meant that nothing was truly private, and everything was subject to scrutiny. This created a culture of paranoia and mistrust within baseball organizations. Players were afraid to express themselves honestly. Executives were afraid to communicate openly. And everyone was constantly worried about how their words and actions might be interpreted if they became public. The cumulative effect of all these changes was that baseball became a much more stressful and difficult environment for everyone involved. The sport that had once been a refuge from the pressures of modern life had become just another arena where people had to constantly worry about public perception and social media backlash. But social media wasn't just creating new problems for baseball. It was also exposing problems that had always existed but had been hidden from public view. The sport's long history of corruption, hypocrisy, and self-serving behavior was being documented and shared in ways that made it impossible to ignore or deny. This created a crisis of credibility for baseball that was different from anything the sport had faced before. Previous scandals had been discrete events that could be addressed and then forgotten. But social media created a permanent record of baseball's failures that could be referenced and shared indefinitely. The sport's response to this crisis was predictable. They tried to adapt their traditional damage control methods to the social media age. They hired social media managers, implemented new communication strategies, and tried to control the narrative through official channels. But these efforts were largely unsuccessful because they were based on the same fundamental approach that had failed in the past, trying to control information rather than addressing the underlying problems. As we've seen throughout this journey through baseball's dark history, the sport has faced scandal after scandal, crisis after crisis, and each time the response has been the same. Find a few scapegoats, implement some cosmetic changes, and hope that people forget about the real problems. From the Black Sox scandal to the steroid era to the sign-stealing controversies, baseball has consistently chosen image management over real reform. But what's truly shocking is how this pattern has persisted despite the massive changes in technology, media, and society that have occurred over the past century. You might think that the transparency of the digital age would have forced baseball to become more honest and accountable. You might think that the scrutiny of social media would have made it impossible to continue the same old patterns of corruption and cover-up. But you would be wrong. The truth is that baseball's leadership has simply adapted their methods to the new reality. They've become more sophisticated in their damage control, more strategic in their public relations, and more effective at managing narratives. They've learned how to use the same tools that were supposed to hold them accountable to instead manipulate public opinion and maintain their power. The Houston Astros scandal is a perfect example of this. When the scandal broke, it looked like it might finally be the reckoning that baseball needed. The evidence was overwhelming, the cheating was systematic, and the public outrage was intense. But baseball's response was a masterclass in damage control. They punished just enough people to satisfy public anger, but not enough to set dangerous precedents. They made just enough changes to create the appearance of reform, but not enough to actually prevent similar scandals in the future. The message was clear. Baseball's leadership had learned nothing from their past mistakes, and they had no intention of changing their fundamental approach to governance. They were still prioritizing profits over integrity, still protecting their own interests over the interests of the sport, and still treating scandals as public relations problems rather than systemic issues. This pattern of behavior raises a troubling question. Is baseball fundamentally unreformable? Has the sport become so corrupted by money and power that it's impossible to restore its integrity? The evidence suggests that the answer might be yes. Consider the incentives that drive baseball's leadership. Team owners make money regardless of whether their teams win or lose, as long as people continue to pay attention to the sport. League executives are rewarded for maintaining stability and profitability, not for ensuring competitive fairness. The system is designed to reward those who can successfully manage crises and maintain the status quo, not those who try to address root causes. This creates a situation where the people with the power to fix baseball's problems have no incentive to do so. In fact, they have strong incentives to maintain the current system, because it's the source of their wealth and power. Why would they change a system that has made them rich and powerful, especially when they've proven that they can survive any scandal as long as they manage it properly? The fans who love baseball and want to see it succeed are essentially powerless in this system. They can complain, they can boycott, they can express their outrage on social media, but ultimately they have no real leverage over the people who make the decisions. The sports leadership knows that fans will eventually come back, because they always have in the past. This creates a tragic situation where the sport that millions of people love is being slowly destroyed by the very people who are supposed to be its guardians. Baseball's leadership has turned the sport into a vehicle for their own enrichment, and they've proven that they're willing to sacrifice the integrity of the game to protect their financial interests. The steroid era was a perfect example of this dynamic. Baseball's leadership knew that steroids were destroying the competitive balance of the sport and creating dangerous health risks for players. But they also knew that the offensive explosion created by steroids was bringing in huge revenues. So they made a calculated decision to allow the steroid era to continue until external pressure forced them to act. The same pattern played out with the sign-stealing scandals. Baseball's leadership knew that teams were using technology to gain unfair advantages, but they also knew that the technological arms race was driving innovation and investment in the sport. So they turned a blind eye until the cheating became so obvious that it was impossible to ignore. This is the real tragedy of baseball's history. It's not just a story of individual bad actors or isolated incidents of corruption. It's a story of systematic failure, of a sport that has been captured by people who care more about their own wealth and power than about the integrity of the game they're supposed to protect. The question now is whether this pattern can ever be broken. Is there any hope that baseball can reform itself, or is the sport doomed to repeat the same cycles of corruption and cover-up indefinitely? The answer depends on whether the forces that have driven baseball's corruption for over a century can be overcome by new pressures and new accountability mechanisms. We started this journey with 8 baseball players taking money to lose the 1919 World Series. We've ended it with a sport that has been systematically corrupted by over a century of greed, racism, and institutional failure. The Black Sox scandal wasn't the beginning of baseball's problems. It was just the first time those problems became impossible to ignore. What we've discovered is that baseball's dark history isn't really about baseball at all. It's about what happens when an institution becomes more important than the principles it's supposed to represent. It's about how power corrupts, how money changes everything, and how good people can become complicit in terrible systems. The players who threw the 1919 World Series weren't evil. They were desperate. They were trapped in a system that treated them like property while making their owners rich. When gamblers offered them a way out, they took it. The owners who exploited them weren't monsters. They were businessmen who saw an opportunity to make money and took it, regardless of the human cost. The pattern has repeated itself over and over again throughout baseball's history. The people who excluded black players from the majors weren't necessarily more racist than the general population. They were following economic incentives that made racism profitable. The executives who ignored the steroid era weren't necessarily more corrupt than their predecessors. They were responding to competitive pressures that made cheating necessary. This is the real lesson of baseball's dark history. Institutions are only as good as the incentives that drive them. When those incentives reward corruption, exploitation, and dishonesty, that's what you get. When they reward transparency, fairness, and integrity, you get something completely different. Baseball has survived over a century of scandals because it has consistently chosen short-term profits over long-term integrity. Every time the sport has faced a crisis, its leadership has done just enough to manage the immediate problem while preserving the underlying system that created the problem in the first place. The tragic irony is that this approach has ultimately been self-defeating. Baseball's refusal to address its systemic problems has gradually eroded its credibility and relevance. The sport that once called itself America's pastime is now struggling to maintain its cultural significance in a world that has many other entertainment options. The game that was invented as a simple diversion has become a complex business empire worth billions of dollars. The players who once played for the love of the game now negotiate contracts worth hundreds of millions of dollars. The fans who once attended games as a community activity now consume baseball as a media product. None of this is necessarily bad, but it has fundamentally changed the nature of the sport. Baseball is no longer just a game. It's an industry with all the moral complexities that entails. The challenge for the sport's future is whether it can find a way to maintain its commercial success while recovering some of its lost integrity. The answer to that question will depend on whether baseball can break the cycle of corruption and cover-up that has defined its history for over a century. It will depend on whether the sport's leadership can learn to prioritize long-term sustainability over short-term profits. And it will depend on whether fans can find ways to hold that leadership accountable for their choices. The history of baseball is ultimately a mirror that reflects the broader history of American society. It shows us how institutions can become corrupted by power and money, how good intentions can be perverted by perverse incentives, and how the pursuit of success can lead to moral compromise. But it also shows us that change is possible. Baseball integrated despite the resistance of its leadership. The reserve clause was eventually eliminated despite the opposition of team owners. Drug testing was implemented despite the protests of players and executives. Progress is possible, even in the most corrupt institutions, if enough pressure is applied in the right way. The question is whether we've learned enough from baseball's dark history to prevent it from repeating itself. The answer depends on whether we're willing to demand better from the institutions we care about, and whether we're willing to accept the costs that come with real reform. Baseball's future depends on the choices that are made today. The sport can continue down the path of corruption and cover-up that has defined its past, or it can choose a different path based on transparency, accountability, and genuine reform. The choice is ours to make, but we have to be willing to make it. The 8 players who threw the 1919 World Series thought they were just trying to make a little extra money. They had no idea that they were participating in a pattern of corruption that would define their sport for over a century. The question now is whether we can finally break that pattern, or whether we're doomed to repeat it forever. The answer depends on whether we're willing to learn from the past, demand better from our institutions, and accept the responsibility that comes with being fans of something we claim to love. Baseball's dark history doesn't have to be its future, but only if we're willing to do the work necessary to change it. The choice is ours. The question is whether we're brave enough to make it.